Okay, yeah, so hello everyone, welcome to what will be hopefully a fascinating and subversive event. For those of you who don't know, this event is part of a larger online festival called Radical May, which has been organised by radical publishers across the world. It's a varied and multilingual programme of roundtables, talks and debates about the ideas that will transform the world to come. For more information, you can follow the hashtag Radical May on Twitter, or there's a link in the description box of the original stream that you can click on to see the schedule of events. Before we start the event properly, I've just got one more announcement. The pandemic is a real existential threat to smaller publishers like ourselves. The book trade is shut down across the world, and we're really struggling to keep our heads above the water. To help see us through, we've set up a new Patreon for our biggest fans, and subscriptions cost as little as £3 a month. Benefits include ebooks, merchandise, special gifts, extended versions of our podcast, Radicals in Conversation, and much more. So head over to patreon.com/PreToPress to see for yourselves. Okay, on to the event. I'll just introduce the topics and the speakers, and then we'll hand over to Max and Phanuel. So today's event is called Revenge as a Human Dream on the Poetics and Politics of Avenging. It's a discussion about Max Haiven's forthcoming book, Revenge Capitalism, The Ghost of Empire, The Demons of Capital, and the Settling of Unpayable Debts, which is out on the 20th of this month. Now, in the book, Max argues that capitalism's economic vengeance helps us explain the culture and politics of revenge we see in society more broadly. Moving from the history of colonialism and its continuing effects today, he examines the opioid crisis in the US, the growth of surplus populations worldwide, and he unpacks the central paradigm of unpayable debts, both as reparations owed and as a methodology of oppression. So tonight, please welcome Max Haiven, the author and Canada Research Chair in Culture, Media and Social Justice at Lakehead University, and Phanuel Antwi, who works with dance and poetry, as well as being an assistant professor at the Department of English Language and Literatures at the University of British Columbia. We're also welcoming questions from the live chat, so please do put your questions to Max and Phanuel, and we'll take the Q&A session towards the end of the event. Okay, right, I'll hand over to Phanuel.
Oh, you're muted. Of course I'm muted. Of course I am. The technical issues continues. I will say thanks, Emily and Chris, for facilitating this conversation and for getting us rolling. It's exciting to have this conversation with Max, and I think I'm going to begin by maybe telling a story. It's not an embarrassing story, but it's a story nonetheless of how I know Max. We met in our grad school sometime in the early 2000s. And we've been in conversation since then. And we did our grad work in our Department of English and Cultural Studies in McMaster University. And I feel the need to say that we did our PhD in English and Cultural Studies because this book actually bears the mark of our training. And what I mean by that is that it bears the mark of cultural studies' commitment to take on an interdisciplinary approach to bear on text, to bear on objects, or to bear on ideas. And so this work actually, I can't help myself but think of it in the tradition of Raymond Williams' idea of the Keywords Project, where it feels as if Max has taken the concept of revenge and actually approached it in all its multiple facets. So this is one of the genealogies that in terms of reading the book, which by the way, I finished this morning. So my brain is still kind of a bit more, crowded with multiple ideas. So I'm going to try to maybe contain some of my ideas because it's going to be, the book itself is so purposefully undisciplined and unworldly. So I feel like our conversation are also going to be undisciplined. And also a bit all over the place in spirit of the book. Having said that, Max, I'm going to begin in the mode of storytelling. I'm going to begin by reading the preface, the first paragraph of the preface, and maybe get you to tell us, to begin the conversation. And this is how the preface begins. The genesis of this book is a story my father told me when I was still quite young about his own father, who died before I was born, and after whom I am named. It's about the first real fight they had. So here's a book about revenge, and you begin by telling us that it's a book about story, and it's also a book about one between your grandfather, and your father. So can you maybe walk us through what is the role? The first question is like, what's the role of storytelling? And what is this revolutionary potential of storytelling that you go on to talk about in this book? If you can begin there. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much. And it's so wonderful to be here and doing this with you. And thank you for that. I thought maybe as I answer that question, I would just share a little bit the table of contents for the book, which we plan to do. Is it possible to see it now on the screen for you? So just so that those who are following along at home can get a sense of this overall structure of the book. And yeah, as you say, the book begins as a book, and it also began with this story that I remember my father telling me a long time ago. And we've spoken about it since. His father was a Holocaust survivor, a survivor of Auschwitz. And my father, without sort of spoiling the story too much for readers, my father was always quite impressed as a child by his father's sort of equanimity and forgiveness towards the Germans who persecuted him in a number of ways. But then at the 6 Days War in the late 1960s, when Israel rebuffed an attack from neighboring countries, his father, who'd never really had a very strong inclination towards political Zionism, found himself cheering on the Israeli troops in this kind of triumphant military conquest. And it really unsettled my father, I think, in a very profound way. And it made him think about revenge and his own father's desire for revenge, which cryptically found its way and its articulation in a kind of anti-Arab racism at that time, and in a sort of desire for a kind of muscular form of nationalism, belligerent nationalism. And I think it led my father to, in some ways, break with many of the things he'd been taught by his family in that moment where he saw revenge flipped on its head. And that story's always stuck with me. I think to some extent, I've tried for many years over the last few books I've written and thought about to try and tell a better story about capitalism. I'm trying to understand what capitalism does in all of its manifold complexity as a system that not only harnesses our time and our labor, but also in some ways our souls. And recently we have, for instance, Franco Bifo Berardi speaking about the soul at work and the way that capitalism puts our innermost dimensions to work in the reproduction of its cycles of accumulation. But I think if we actually took an honest look at the histories of empire, the histories of race and racism, at the history of other forms of oppression as they entangle themselves with capitalism, maybe we realize that for a long time, capitalism has depended on giving us resources to tell a very bad story about who we are and what we could be. And so for me, the idea of approaching a book like this and it is a book of theory, but as a book of revolutionary storytelling, is about inviting myself to try and tell a better, more complex, more rich and more satisfying story about how we came to arrive at the place where we are. And what is that place? Well, in this case, it is a place where, unfortunately, our the global scene seems to be stalked by the specters of revenge politics. But for me in this book, I want to say, if we want to have an honest reckoning with and an honest storytelling about where this revenge politics came, the politics of the far right, the politics of neo-fundamentalisms, the politics of resurgent and revanchist racism, then we need to tell a longer and more entangled story about how these things have been with us for a long time.
Hearing you talk about this longer and entangled story about who we are, I can't help it but think of Sylvia Wynter's idea of homo narrans, the idea that we become who we are as a species through storytelling. How is that? How are you thinking about it, both in terms of the we in this larger scale of species, and the we in the particular in terms of whether it be the case of your family story or the case of the examples that you give in the book?
I mean, Sylvia Wynter's work has been so profoundly transformative for me, and I discovered it very late in my, and quite recently. It really comes into play for me, I think, in the fourth chapter of the book, where I talk about the Opium Wars and how they translate into the opium crisis in the United States and elsewhere now. And I try and think through, using her work, the way that whiteness as a socially constructed category has a kind of narcotic quality. I think that idea that she presents to us, that we are not Homo economicus, we are not the money-making, acquisitive, competitive animal that we have been instructed is the norm, but instead we're a storytelling species. And that our storytelling is not only a matter of culture, it's also a matter of how we literally transform our bodies and our chemistry, our neurochemistry. Was really a profound revelation for me. I think what she points to is how powerful the story is in creating what she calls a referent we, with a dash between it, referent we, by which dominant groups designate who is desirable and selectable and who is abject and should be excluded. And so for me, I take from that, on the one hand, the incredible danger of ever using the pronoun we. And yet at the same time, I from Wynter, this incredible, against all odds, strange optimism that we need to account for ourselves and take responsibility for ourselves as the storytelling species, and therefore call ourselves to a higher kind of we that might actually be able to encompass the incredible breadth of our experience without, doing this terrible injustice and violence that so often you hear from sort of liberal mainstream commentators when they want to talk about all of humanity.
And I guess I'm also hearing that this we is not a homogeneous we either.
No, not at all. Not at all. I think it's a we, to paraphrase the Zapatistas, it's a we in which all we's fit.
Yes, the we's of nobodies almost. To put it in that way. You began by saying something about how you've sought to tell a better story about capitalism in your work, and there's a way that the grammar of revenge that you are trying to articulate and the story of revenge that you are trying to articulate demonstrates that. So let me ask you this question: why add another adjective to capitalism? I mean, if adjectives, so what is it about capitalism that you are trying to modify for us when you add revenge to it, in that sense? Yeah.
I think there's a long project ever since we've started to develop a language for discussing capitalism to add an adjective to make certain things clear.
COVID capitalism, pandemic capitalism.
Quite. And some of the texts that were very influential to me in writing this were things like racial capitalism or carceral capitalism or gore capitalism. We've seen a number of books that have come out of the last few years that use this method of adding an adjective to the beginning. And I think first and foremost, I would say that I don't think it's a matter of, one of those adjectives getting it right, oh, this is the real capitalism. Because of course, capitalism wears many masks, and it wears different masks to different people. So what to some of us may look like neoliberal capitalism or cognitive capitalism looks to others like gore capitalism, carceral capitalism, racial capitalism. And we need to be able to tell stories that are complex enough to allow us to take those different vantages at once. The particular vantage I wanted to take in this book was to, in a certain way, speak back to a certain tendency I saw emerging after sort of 2005, 2006, where there was a kind of surprise at the return of revenge politics, or a surprise at anger as this major political factor, a surprise at the success, for instance, of Donald Trump or the Brexit vote, Modi in India, Erdogan in Turkey, and you know, these sort of far right revanchist movements elsewhere. And I wanted to say, in taking up the revanchist politics, the kind of revengeful, seemingly nihilistic political rhetoric that those politicians and their supporters were using, I wanted to ask us to look again and say, no, that's not just politics. That's not just some woeful thing that happened and it came out of the blue and it interrupted the otherwise well-flowing nature of global capitalism and the progress of liberalism and democracy. Instead, actually, something in the very grammar of the system, this vengefulness that I'm trying to get at, now makes itself known in the field of politics. And that's neither an exclusively good or an exclusively bad thing. And so for me, adding the adjective is really about adding another lens or another way to look at capitalism, but it's not the exclusive one.
Okay. And in this lens that you are adding, what are you hoping it would do? So,
yeah. I guess maybe two things. I mean, once, you know, to tell a better, longer story, to have a better common memory that makes us recall that the history of capitalism has always been deeply vengeful, but it's been unequally vengeful. It's been vengeful against certain people, certain bodies that have been racialized, bodies that have been colonized, bodies that have been exploited through the terrors of class. Gendered bodies that don't conform to the paragon of Homo economicus, and so on. So this vengefulness has always been there. It's just been that mostly the people who are given the affordances to write about capitalism have not necessarily experienced them directly, and so they become invisibilized. But the second thing I want to do in this book is I wanted to account for my own and many people's feelings of deep simmering rage and a desire for revenge, and to parse out when those are useful and when they are not useful, and to parse out a more complex language about revenge that doesn't just simply consign it to this sort of demon which should have been borders.
I'm struck by, so there's vocabulary that is coming up that maybe we should clarify for those who haven't read the book. We're talking about revenge, and then all of a sudden, revenge capitalism, and you're thinking through the grammar or the logic of revenge, and then all of a sudden you are using the language of vengeance, right? So for the readers who haven't read the book yet, how are you moving from revenge and vengeance, and how do they make sense of that?
Yeah. So I think the major distinction I really try and make in the book is between revenge and avenging, which is this, it's such a subtle distinction, but one that goes back quite a ways. I mean, Samuel Johnson makes this distinction in his, famous 18th century dictionary. And to a certain extent, it makes sense to us because, of course, the Avengers are clearly a hero group, and the Revengers are clearly villains. Even I think a child could give us this intuition about the way in which we use these terms. I suppose in my reckoning of revenge in this book, I want to use it mostly to describe two parallel currents. The first is that I want to talk about how a system can take revenge. I want to talk about how it's not just an individual human passion, not only a human dream, to quote the name that we gave to this discussion, but actually something that can be baked into the very nature and logic of a system like capitalism. And that a system like capitalism can take revenge on us, it can take revenge on the earth, it can take revenge on people, without anyone necessarily wanting it or intending it, although many people do want and intend it, especially on sort of the far right. So on the one hand, I want to think about revenge in this way, as something that emerges from the way a system works, rather than as the motivation for how a system works. At the same time, I wanted to understand the way that throughout capitalism's history and its entangled history with colonialism, there's been a constant way in which the demands of the oppressed, the exploited, the colonized have been defamed and denigrated by those in power as recklessly nihilistically vengeful, in the sense that slave revolts, revolts of colonized people, working class revolts, even the movement of the suffragettes for women's votes at the turn of the century, these were all labeled by the powers that be as pathological, as vindictive, as animated by these sort of terroristic spirits. And I'm interested in the way that then capitalism is able to displace its own vengeful nature onto others, onto the others that it labels the witches, so to speak. Something that I trace back in the book to Francis Bacon. Okay, this is the kind of two-way movement of revenge that I'm trying to understand. And then I want to try and recuperate something of revenge that I speak about as avenging, and what I think about later as the avenging imaginary, which is to say, I want to ask, what would it mean to not constantly flee from revenge and imagine that revenge is a terrible political category that only leads to ruin and destruction, but walk towards some aspect of it? And the notion of avenging that I try and develop in the book is one that I see popping up throughout the history of capitalism in social movements, where people say, I want revenge, but I don't want revenge on this or that individual, especially. I want revenge on the system, and I want to have a vengeance that will mean that the system can no longer take revenge upon me and people that I care about. I want to avenge the things that have been done to me, my ancestors, the people I love, in a way that abolishes the power that caused the harm in the first place. Yeah. And I think in this book, I move towards that horizon and don't necessarily arrive there as many readers would hope I would. But that, I think, is intentional and something we might return.
We'll get to it at the we'll get to it, because I was struck by that as well. That particularly the disappointment, to use your language, I think the conclusion, the disappointment that you acknowledge your readers might feel in how you are rendering the end of this work. There's a thinker, philosopher, theorist, storyteller who takes central stage in this book. And actually you use a quotation of his twice. It first appears in chapter 1 and then again the conclusion. And this is Walter Benjamin's his thesis on the philosophy of history. Like, if we maybe can turn to page 32 of your book. Why? Like, I'm super curious. Why is this quotation so meaningful, and why do you repeat it? It's on page, if I remember correctly. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah. Actually, it's here. 32.
No, that's 32.
Yes, 31 to 32. This one here, in Marx, the proletariat appears as the last enslaved class, as the avenger that completes the task of liberation in the name of the generations of the downtrodden. This conviction, which had a brief resurgence in the Spartacist group, has always been objectionable to social democrats. Within 3 decades, they managed virtually to erase the name of Blanqui, though it had been the rallying sound that had reverberated throughout the preceding century. Social democracy thought it fit to assign to the working class the role of the redeemer of future generations, but in this way cut the sinews of its greatest strength. This training made the working class forget both its hatred and its spirit of sacrifice, for both are nourished by the image of enslaved ancestors rather than liberated grandchildren.
Yeah.
I have, this text, Theses on the Philosophy of History by Walter Benjamin, has been with me my entire academic life, which is, and has haunted me. And I still don't think I fully understand it, but something about this passage resonated with me and was the kind of the sand that creates the pearl for the oyster. It's something that I worried and worried. And for me, I think it's very important because he's pointing to the problem that the German Social Democrat Party faced in the 1920s as it looked, for all intents and purposes, in the 1920s that Germany would go towards a communist or socialist revolution. And then, of course, by the early 1930s, pivoted as far right as you can possibly go towards Nazism. And Benjamin wrote these words while he was on the run from the Nazis. He died while fleeing the Nazis in the Pyrenees, and was thinking, well, what did the Social Democrats miss? And what I take here to him to be saying is that they missed the sense that the proletariat, for whom, you know, because Benjamin is quite a rigorous Marxist, he really sees them as the final class of the great class struggle, the class that is going to overturn history and finally create a kind of mass liberation of all people. That this class is, their job is not simply to build a beautiful future only, but that part of building that beautiful future is this quest for what I term avenging, this somehow answering the injustices of the past. And a bit later in the same text, Benjamin says, in a quotation that I use at the book's conclusion, that to paraphrase, there's a debt that is owed by the present to the past. And that our coming as people who struggle today was expected on earth. And that we are called to avenge in some way the struggles of those who came before us but were vanquished. And that debt, he says, cannot be settled cheaply. And I find it of great solace and meditative value this many years in thinking about both how to think, how to theorize, and also what it means to be an activist in this moment. And the reason I think that this quotation is so important for me now is I feel that in the face of the rise of the far right, as we've seen it in the last few years, in the face of a resurgence of racism and neo-colonial and neo-imperial feeling, there is a sense that the Social Democrats then, not today as then, are still fixated on this kind of forward together insistence on a kind of unquestionable positive affect of kind of an optimism. And I really want us to dwell more with the things that scare us, because I think they're at work under the surface. And if we don't pay attention to them, things like revenge, they will easily be monopolized by others. And I think this comes through, again, in the book's conclusion too, where I turn also to the work of Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks, who caution, you know, other Black liberation and feminist activists in the 1970s and 80s not to turn away from anger and not to turn away from vengefulness, that there is something there to offer that we can't do without, and that the kind of knee-jerk pushing away of this, what in the book I call reconcilophilia, maybe doesn't do us the service we think it does.
And see, and Max, this is what confounds me about the book. See, on the one hand, you refer to revenge as this logic, right? And then at the very same time, I get to the conclusion, or throughout the whole book, or rather, you engage with revenge as some form of feeling. So when you turn to anger, as you turn to in the conclusion by Lorde and Hooks, they are both engaging with these affective registers and not dismissing them, and in terms of their transformative possibilities. So help me understand how revenge, you caution us, you're saying that you actually do see that it's not necessarily a feeling, and rather a logic, and then it plays out with all of these kind of or things through these affective registers. How are you reconciling this affective register that I see the book as engaging in, and at the very same time wanting to maybe kind of stay a bit of a distance?
It's such an hard question, because I think it strikes at something that you and I both struggle with in our work so much, which is how do you, at the one hand, account for the way that a category can be a social construction and at the same time hold fast to it. So in this case, I think revenge, how we understand revenge, what we understand revenge to be, is shaped by the society in which we find ourselves. It's shaped by the power relations in which we find ourselves. You know, a lot of the time when I tell people I was working on a book on revenge, they would say, well, you know, the assumption would be that revenge hasn't changed. It's been the same since the time of the ancient Greeks, or it's the same as the stories that we associate with revenge in indigenous cosmologies. That revenge is this universal. And there might be some merit to that. I mean, we do see across the whole sweep and diversity of human storytelling and mythologies that something we would identify as revenge reappears. However, my argument in the book is that in every age, in every society, there are dominant notions of what revenge is and dominant feelings about revenge. If it's a fearful thing, if it's an honorable thing, if it's a joyful thing. And that's shaped by the power relations of our day. So my argument in the book is revenge as we understand it, and we can't help but understand it in this way, has been shaped by capitalism. It's not only that capitalism takes revenge, it's that, that our entire idea about revenge has been constructed within capitalism. And so this book is an attempt to, in some ways, break us a little bit out of the way in which we've learned to think about revenge, to take us a different place. So within that, I think we have to say that yes, anger and resentment and ressentiment, the kind of Nietzschean notion of resentment, and fear and sort of bloodlust, all of these things are associated with revenge, but they are not the same as revenge. And so I want to pull them apart from revenge for a moment so that then we can see how they fit back together again. And at the same time as I'm doing that sort of work to try and understand how our notion of revenge has been constructed, I also then want to create some more sort of positive definitions of revenge and avenging as being something that have to do with systems and the way that we respond to systems, to take it away from this idea that revenge is simply something that happens between individuals, as we've been instructed by Hollywood and endless narratives of the same.
Yeah, I have other questions, but maybe I will stay with this for one more follow-up, which is, and it has to do with, maybe I'm pushing it a little bit about this tension, the economy and emotion in some sense, like that. Maybe I'll find a way to come back to it. I'll come back to it some other way. I'm thinking about how you are rendering. So the subtitle of the book, if we can remind listeners or viewers, the subtitle of the book is The Ghosts of Empire, The Demons of Capital, and the Settling of Unpayable Debts. I want to zoom in a little bit on the settling of unpayable debts following this conversation, following this question, your response. How are you rendering unpayable debts in relation to revenge? Particularly since in the chapter, in chapter 2, you talk about the debt from above and the debt from below. I would like to hear this idea of settling of unpayable debts in relation to revenge.
Yeah, I've been working on debt as a topic for many years, and I'm just sharing on the screen here the cover of the book. Just to reflect the subtitle you were mentioning. I've been working on this topic of debt for many years because the bulk of my scholarly work has been about financialization. So the way that banking and finance and speculative capital not only have an impact on the economy at large, but also have an effect on daily life, on the structures of feeling, on the way in which we interact, on the way in which we perceive ourselves and cooperate and participate in the world. And in this book, I really wanted to take this question of debt to another level, to think about two forms of debt which are sort of unspoken or unspeakable in our global order. And in order to think through the unspoken or unspeakable, I turn to art in the third chapter of the book. Those are debts from above, or unpayable debts from above, and unpayable debts from below. And very briefly, an unpayable debt from above is the kind of debt that's been forced on, for instance, Greece, or on Puerto Rico, or that was forced onto Haiti after its liberation, or that has really been used to neo-colonize most of the global South in the wake of decolonization movements in the latter half of the 20th century, where debt and an unpayable debt, an unsurmountable debt, becomes a means to leverage a control over a whole population. But I'm also thinking about the unpayable debts that many of us owe. You know, there's a statistic that I quote in the book that, in fact, perhaps the majority of people in the United Kingdom, where I am right now, will actually die in debt. Yeah. They will not be able to repay their. And so, what does that even mean when you can't do that? When you are encumbered by a debt that constrains your life possibilities, that essentially exploits and extorts your labor, that you're never going to crawl out of. And of course, you know, someone like David Graeber has thought about this in a really profound way. Saidiya Hartman, whose work is very inspirational in that chapter, also talks about what it means to be under not only a constant financial debt, but a constant moral debt that keeps you in a kind of bondage. In her case, she's thinking about the condition of those enslaved people who became freed after the American Civil War. So on the one hand, we have these unpayable debts from above that impinge and seem to then transcend any kind of rational economic sense that the neoliberal order would claim to be dominated by. At the same time, we have what I characterize as unpayable debts from below. And these are the debts that are owed to people and to groups that have been oppressed, exploited, who have survived genocide, but that the system cannot admit, accept, or really even acknowledge. These would be the debts that are owed for reparation. We're here in London, and there's people are clapping just outside for the NHS workers here. It's 8 o'clock. So we acknowledge the unpayable debt owed to frontline healthcare workers right now in the pandemic. These are debts that, you know, when we think about reparations for slavery or the restoration of land stolen from indigenous people, or the incredible violence done in the processes of colonialism, these unpayable debts from below cannot be acknowledged or admitted or repaid within the current order. And yet demanding them is a kind of radical work and can inspire incredible forms of activism. And in both cases, I want to think through debt as a kind of revenge. If you have an unpayable debt from above imposed upon you, the debt, in a certain sense, in a structural and systemic way, without anyone intending it, is vengeful. It acts vengefully upon you, whether it's an individual or whole nation. And similarly, for those who are claiming unpayable debts from below, those claiming of debts from the perspective of the powerful, from whom the debts are claimed, can only be interpreted by the powerful as vengeance. Mm-hmm. So when the claim for reparations comes, when the claim for the restoration of stolen lands comes, it becomes interpreted in the worldview of the powerful as a form of revenge, and therefore defamed and slandered as nihilistic and destructive and you know, against the entire fabric of civilization itself.
No, that's super interesting. I find the distinction really as slippery as avenging and revenge in terms of how you're thinking through debt from below and debt from above. To whom is one avenging, and to whom is it revenge in that sense? Because that constitutes the imagination, right? The imaginary capacity and how one is interpreting the action. Which actually, I'll save that question as well. Let's go to there's in your third chapter, you introduce this idea of the hidden ledger, and working with James Scott. Scott's idea of the hidden transcripts. You introduce the idea, and you illustrate this hidden ledger through 3 stories of proletarian vengeance against money. I would like to hear you talk a little bit about how this hidden ledger becomes an act of resistance or a mode of almost pushing back against this vengeful or this structural violence that is enacted through money.
So I think just to give the viewers maybe a little bit of context.
Yeah, the stories, the three stories. Yeah, sorry.
In this chapter, I'm trying to push back against something that I've seen emerge recently in sort of anti-capitalist circles, which is what I see as a very unhelpful optimism to the idea that we can just redesign money now and then everything will be great. You know, if we could just fix money and create a proper like system based on like bitcoins or blockchains or cryptocurrencies or whatever, even local currencies, then everything else would fall into place, like a kind of chiropractic where you press the right part of the spine and everything kind of works out. Exactly. And I wanted to note a bit of skepticism toward this and also steal back something that gets talked about in many circles of financial innovation. And I guess I wanted to ask this question, well, what would financial innovation look like from the perspective of those who had always been not only excluded from money, but actually like deeply oppressed and exploited by money? And to do that, I pick up this notion of the hidden ledger, which takes from James C. Scott's notion of the hidden transcript, which in a nutshell is that like most historians, because they're just relying on the writings of the rich and powerful, we never actually get a very good view of what oppressed and exploited people are thinking. And of course, in the worldview and the historians of the rich and powerful, they just say, oh, you know, the people love the king and they just love the boss and these enslaved people are happy and these colonized people, they just love what's going on. I mean, but for Scott, there's a hidden transcript that exists, and we need to be attentive to what people are actually saying and what they're actually thinking. And I transmute this to talk about the hidden ledger, to think about the ledger books of empire, the accounting, and maybe there's a hidden accounting underneath. And so this ties into the kind of revolutionary storytelling I'm trying to approach in the book. And so I tell these sort of three stories that I found fascinating over the years. The first is about what are called convict love tokens. And these were carved by prisoners, or they were commissioned by prisoners who were awaiting transportation from Newgate prison or the hulks here in the city of London to be transported to the colonies to become indentured servants, but also at the same time, they would become colonists, settler colonists in Australia and the Americas. And they would carve these, they would take a king's coin and efface the king's image and the iconography on the coin, and then carve their own messages to their loved ones in the coin as something to leave behind, because most of them would either die on the voyage or die in the hard labor of the colonies or never be able to accumulate enough money to return. In the second case, I look at hobo nickels, which were sort of had their heyday between the 1920s and 1940s by hobos who were riding the rails in the United States during the Great Depression, sort of this mass of surplus humanity, surplus population, who had been made surplus by the capitalist system, who similarly were carving onto the face of the coin their own unique designs and messages as a kind of medium for a different kind of solidarity. These coins in both cases were not used as a medium of commerce, or not at least in terms of like economic commerce as we understand it. They were used as a medium of fellow feeling, of solidarity, of communication amongst the oppressed and the excluded. And the final example is of what's called Notgeld, which is emergency money that was minted in Weimar, Germany. The ruinous debt that the Allied powers placed upon Germany after the First World War meant that there was this massive runaway inflation and German money became worthless, basically. And so municipalities and even merchants would start minting their own emergency money in denominations of like 1 billion marks or 10 billion marks, which would, you know, buy you a loaf of bread or something. But this led to a whole explosion of creativity about people reimagining and taking back money into their hands as something they could create to express not a kind of eternal law of supply and demand as per Adam Smith and the myth of Homo economicus, but actually something that would wind together communities that needed to rely on each other and mutual aid much more in that moment of sort of dire crisis and dire stress. And so I look at the work of an art duo, a contemporary art duo these days, named Kahn and Selesnik, who kind of play with the myth of an iceberg free state, as it's called, an iceberg that floats into the German port city of Lubeck and then gets a currency minted on its behalf, as if it were a free sort of anarchist temporary autonomous zone. So these three stories have almost been lost to history in a certain sense, but I want to take them back in the spirit that we were talking about of Walter Benjamin's invitation to think through what it would mean to rekindle and avenge the dreams that of the vanquished who came before us. So what can we learn about money and capitalism from these kind of strange esoteric attempts from those at its very farthest margins?
And I think so there's what we can learn from them in terms of our practices now, but also what we can learn about them in their moment of circulation. So what I find fascinating about them is that whether it be the convict love tokens or the hobo nickels, is that those were public transcripts to kind of use Scott's language in that book. They were themselves circulated, and yet at the very same time, they were actually they were being repurposed for something else. So there's modes of deception that it's our work here that I'm seeing you wanting to think about. Deception here, again, in the mode of affect, not as a positive or a negative, but in terms of what is being done, what is being mobilized for, what's the cultural work that this deceptive act is doing, in that sense. And that's one thing I'm finding really quite excited in terms of how you turn to these stories. And they are also, in this case, they are stories. Like, this is what I find fascinating, because the more that you write it, you said, oh, it's been said. So even in your narration of it, it becomes this rumor, these gossip, these folktale. Again, these are also part of those transcripts, which then begin to actually offer possibilities for when you talk about these revolutionary storytelling. So again, this is where I go back to revenge and its multiple affective villains, right? So not having one affective hub, so to speak. But it can have these it kind of allows multiple things to coalesce at once, yeah, which I find really fascinating. So let's move on, because I'm looking at time right now, and I'm looking at, are there any questions yet for us, Emily, or are we fine? Okay, so I can ask one more question. The two more questions, maybe three more questions. I'm thinking to, so as I was saying to you folks, I just finished this book this morning, and as I was getting ready for this, I kept on thinking about how methodologically what you've done in this book, and it's, again, when I say it's quite undisciplined and unwieldy, it's really a methodological feat. I'm thinking about the archives that you are able to kind of bring together to how to tell this story. And I'm thinking particularly about chapter 4, when you talk about the Opium Wars. And the book that comes to mind immediately in terms of methodological and the approach is Lisa Lowe's the Intimacies of the Four Continent. And this, because here is let's read, like, actually, before I even go on, let me read you the opening sentence, how you begin this chapter. Where is it? Where would you be? Page chapter 4, the opening chapter. You take on this huge, you move us from the Caribbean to North America, to Asia, to Europe, and you loop us back again. It's like this, it's like say we are continuously being looped, and then all of a sudden you just hold us still, and it's something that I marvel at how that happens. And so I think it's worth showing how you begin it, to see you begin from this really statistics. Okay, where are you? Opium War.
Are you thinking about the statistic about
yes,
the opioid?
That's right. That's
States?
right.
Yes, yes.
That's right. Page 120.
120. Okay. Yeah. So this chapter, in some sense, is an attempt to account for this terrifying statistic that demographers have pointed out in the United States, that the greatest predictor of if a jurisdiction in the United States, a county, would swing from voting for Barack Obama in 2012 to voting for Donald Trump in 2016 was the proportion of so-called deaths from despair in that jurisdiction. So deaths from despair include deaths from alcoholism, suicide, and very importantly, opioid overdose. And here, for those outside of the United States who are maybe less familiar with this, the United States is right now, and for the last 10 years, has been embroiled in a totally catastrophic prescription opioid nightmare, where a huge percentage of the American population became addicted to opioids that are more powerful than street heroin, that were basically pushed on them by doctors that were in turn under a huge amount of pressure from pharmaceutical companies that had essentially gamed the medical data to make it appear that these drugs were not addictive, when in fact, of course, they were extremely addictive. This correlation between, on the one hand, deaths from despair and opioid overdoses, and what I'm terming revenge politics, the revenge politics of Donald Trump, I think on the one hand seems very intuitive to us. And we have heard a great deal about the anger of the so-called white working class in the United States and how they were disenfranchised and forgotten. And there's an aspect of that that is true. These are also people who have been chewed up and spit out by capitalism. And yet the way in which that has been framed by the demographers and by mainstream commentators has done us an incredible disservice in terms of allowing us to understand the much deeper and longer roots of the connection between drugs, narcotics, culture, race, and injustice in the United States. So in this chapter, I go back to the Opium Wars, where the British especially, but also other Western powers, basically forced the Chinese empire in the mid-1800s to import tons and tons and tons of opium with catastrophic effects on Chinese society. And when the Chinese empire attempted to forbid the importation of opium, the European powers led by the British essentially attacked the Chinese empire and with overwhelming force and forced them to reopen the markets. And this led to a whole range of social catastrophes for the Chinese people, the most populous, until then, the richest nation on earth. But also with many resonances that travel down to us, because while on the one hand, the loot, as they called it, that flowed into the United States and the UK and France from China during these years went on to help build those massive empires, it also really contributed to the building of a kind of white supremacist worldview that sort of inscribed or conscripted the working class to a kind of fellow feeling or fidelity with empire, such that they saw that their fate was more bound up with their class enemies within the empire than with all of the other people around the world that the empire was exploiting. And not only from this moment, but from before it, but in this moment, I think is emblematic, we begin to see a real connection between, on the one hand, the kind of displacement of responsibility for drug epidemics onto racialized people. So in the 19th century in the United States and in England, Chinese people or people presumed to be of Chinese origin were blamed for the opium that was coming into these countries, even though, of course, it was the empires themselves that were producing the massive opium trade. We also begin to see the association of drugs with, in the United States especially, with people of Latin American origin, and the displacement of social antagonisms within capitalism onto racialized people as outsiders and threats. But we also begin to see what I think about in this chapter as the narcotic quality of whiteness itself. And I mean that in two ways. On the one hand, whiteness as a social construct. We're not talking about the particular phenotypical characteristics of people who are today considered white. We're talking about whiteness as a social construct that is historically situated and built and rebuilt in the relations of power as an abstraction that becomes real. That notion of whiteness then encourages those people who can access whiteness, who are considered white, to forget in some way and desensitize themselves to the suffering of others who are considered to be non-white. And so it has this anesthetic effect. It dulls our sensitivity. It makes us not care, not feel for others. And likewise, however, as capitalism's contradictions grow, as they have in the last 20 years over the span of the opioid epidemic in the United States, the drug of whiteness, if we can frame it that way, becomes less and less effective because it no longer delivers the same kind of material securities it was once imagined to be able to deliver. And so whiteness gets more and more violent, as so often tragically happens with those who are addicted, especially to opium-related drugs, when those drugs are deprived in the sort of horrific effects that drug portends. And I want to tie in here just before concluding the question that Emily has shared with us from from the audience, because I think it really ties in. Mark writes, would one example of revenge capitalism in a systemic way be that way people are treated badly in the United States when ill, in that if you wish to receive care, you must have insurance? If so, what other real examples can you give us? And I think that is a great example. It's precisely, you know, the society has the capacity to care for you. The resources exist. It's simply a matter that those resources are being redirected towards the wealthy, and your deprivation of care becomes a form by which the system takes a kind of revenge, though no one necessarily intends it. There's no evil mastermind out there who says, I want revenge on you because you're poor, etc. Now, the one thing I would say to tie this in is that what's so interesting about the opioid epidemic in the United States is that demographers have noted, and many white supremacists have also wanted to mobilize around the fact that this ailment, the opioid epidemic, seems to have somehow missed non-white people. At least non-white people have not succumbed to the opioid epidemic to the same extent that they have succumbed to other previous epidemics, for instance, street heroin or crack cocaine in previous moments of American capitalism. But the reasons, once we look at this, are actually incredibly damning, and it ties to precisely Mark's question here. Black people, especially in the United States, when they would go to doctors, would be prescribed pain medication at a far lower rate because doctors, though they were none of them perhaps explicitly white supremacists or racists, in spite of that, there was a cultural understanding among doctors that Black people felt less pain and that they could endure higher rates of pain. And therefore, Black people were denied prescriptions for these pain medications at a much higher rate than white people were. And similarly, Black people in the United States tended, not always, but tended to live in neighborhoods that had much less access to pharmaceutical care, much less access to pharmacies that would stock these drugs. And so they were, in a weird way, demographically speaking, spared the kind of devastating effect that the opioid epidemic has had on white communities, with the proviso that still hundreds of thousands of Black people and people of color in the United States are suffering from opioid dependencies that were caused by the drug pushers at the top of the corporate ladder. It's just demographically speaking, there's such an exceptional pattern here compared to what other patterns have been in the past.
What I find super fascinating here is you direct our attention to Buck Morris's work on the capitalist sensorium, right? And so here, demography that are often perceived as overly affectable, and this is Denise De Silva's language of affectable, the global idea of race. These are groups that are seen as heavily affectable, and at the very same time are imagined to feel less pain. And so it is this moment when the capitalist sensorium sees this the proletarian as sensing, feeling entities, and at the very same time, it kind of sees them as actually unable to feel pain. So I find these moments really quite two sides of the same equation in terms of the logic of producing disposable bodies.
It's such a riddle. Yeah.
There's a question from Brittany, and she asks, should we be seeking to overcome revenge or redefine it under socialism or communism?
That's such a great question. I mean, yes, I mean, ultimately, I think that I would like to live in a system which is not in and of itself fundamentally vengeful. And I think capitalism is a system that's fundamentally vengeful. But a lot rests in what you define as the definition. I mean, I think most as I've mentioned before, I think the socialist and communist dream, whether they've been articulated in the kind of conventions of Western and sort of Eurocentric Marxism, or whether they've been articulated in the kind of global South forms of Marxism, have been understood by capitalists and those who benefit from capitalism as recklessly vengeful. That, you know, this is the lazy and entitled poor demanding their revenge on the hardworking rich. And this is a theme that we see constantly repeated. So in a weird way, I think that there is something that's necessary about cultivating what I'm calling the avenging imaginary to get us to a horizon where some sort of form of socialism or communism might be possible. What would revenge look like after some sort of revolutionary change? I don't know. I mean, I think in a weird way, my book is not so useful in towards that question, for which I can only say it'll have to be in a future book. And the reason is this: it's not because I think that there will be no revenge after some perfect revolution and we're all happy and we just go around and there'll be no more heartbreak and everything will be great. Would that were true. I think rather in a future society, we will have new words for common feelings and new feelings for common words, to frame it in a certain way. I think what we mean by revenge will change in a society where the system itself is not seeking to take revenge on us. And the work of this book to try and recapture a meaning of revenge, to use it in a different way, will no longer be quite as necessary. Mm-hmm. That said, I think that there is something, now to go against my own claims, I think there is something fundamental about what happens when we're hurt or when something's taken from us that makes us respond in certain ways. But whether we decide to call that revenge or something else, whether we think that revenge is good and bad, whether we think that revenge and avenging are different, I think will look very, very different in a different side of society, where perhaps the wounds that would cause us to take revenge will not cut so deep in a society where everyone's actually cared for.
It's funny, like in the conclusion, you avoid and I'm seeing why you perhaps even avoid giving any kind of answers, if that's even the word. Like part of this book has been attempting to be it's been a collaborative thinking work with so many scholars. I mean, for those of you who have read it, you know what I mean, and for those of you who are going to read it, you will see it. It feels as if there's a chorus at work here that are moving together, are thinking together. And so when I'm hearing a question in terms of answers, I think it falls short in terms of what is the context of this question, what is the context of the situation, what is the history that's happening there. You talk about this entangled logic that you are trying to work through, and so any movement requires equally to be an entangled movement. And so, like, for example, you end by saying that you want to ground your, you want to avoid a common temptation to include with a celebration of what movements, and you go on. You want to also stay away from theorizing it in terms of what you call it. Wow, what did you say? Let me see. You take a whole paragraph where you say, I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to do that. And in fact, even though it's in the negative, it's in the I'm not going to do it. That was more instructive as an answer than what you would have done, if that makes sense. So you begin by saying on page 191, you say, at risk of disappointing the reader, who surely by now is holding back demoralization in the hopes of triumphant conclusion, in the remaining pages, I can only offer some hints as to what an avenging imaginary might be that could, without failing. Thank you. Where was I? Without failing, prey to the lure of reconciliophilia, rise to the challenge of our moment, and contribute to the kind of revolutionary movements we would need to capsize and replace revenge capitalism. I have opted to decline the urge to be prescriptive in this book. I have also opted, for the most part, to avoid a common temptation to conclude with a celebration of contemporary social movements, though I am inspired by many and believe that collective mobilization is the only way to, and you go on. Rather, I have opted to take wisdom from a set of authors who, while like all of us caught up in revenge capitalism, theorize from the perspective of communities most targeted by its vengefulness, notably radical indigenous thinkers from the territories currently colonized by Canada, and Black feminist thinkers are struggling within, against, and beyond the confines of a white supremacist United States. So, and then you go on to say that I rely on below ground the analysis of resentment, anger, and solidarity in the experiences of intersectional Black, indigenous, and queer positionalities, which have been systematically disempowered and have access to few, if any, privileges within revenge capitalism. So, I mean, I'm really moved by this move of refusal. There's a mode of refusing the idea of this is what we need to do, and rather what have folks been doing within these traditions that are worth holding on to. So maybe the question for you to help us think through, why choose, what does it mean to end your meditation by relying on these analyses, these positionalities? What does it mean to kind of end on this chorus? And you would see what I mean by chorus when you read the book, just given these intense meditation on their writing. Why?
I think to some extent because I want to confess that I just don't know. Okay. I mean, it's a confession of my own ignorance. There's many things I could write about my personal feelings about anger and vengefulness and resentment from my own experience as sort of a white male cis hetero sort of activist academic. And I've written about that elsewhere. I think it's much more interesting to hear from this plurality of voices, and specifically to hear from the voices of theorists who are coming from an embodied space where many of the forms of acceptance or inclusion into the revenge capitalist apparatus are not available. You know, for me, I am welcomed, given my embodied position in society, I'm welcomed to take a place in revenge capitalism. I'm welcomed every day as a professor, you know, as part of us, I'm welcomed to take the rewards and the benefits from participating and reproducing the system. And I felt that based on that, there's something about revenge that I don't understand fully. There's something that, I mean, certainly there is a desire for vengeance against this system that burns in me, but I think it might burn brighter and clearer in others. And so the wager at the end of the book is that by taking up the work of people who were never offered and were never meant to survive within revenge capitalism, there would be something there that I couldn't express and articulate.
Is it possible that some of these thinkers are also not interested in entering revenge capital, the system of that? And yeah, so.
I think so. And I think all of the thinkers are also people who look revenge in the face and then make a very strategic choice about how to engage it.
Exactly. Yes.
Because, you know, in the section there with Bell Hooks, she speaks about the danger of approaching vengefulness that she learned very young, as a very young person growing up in the US South, that vengeance and blackness was a recipe for murder. I mean, you would be killed if white people in the South suspected you of even having vengeance in mind. And so there's a way that the vengeance turned inwards. And that's something that I just think that, you know, I mean, I talk quite openly at the beginning of the book about my own family experience and history, but it's something that I think I wouldn't necessarily understand. So I think turning to these authors who have this experience, this complex experience of the politics of vengeance, then allows me to end the book with an opening rather than a closing.
How could it, there's a question here, so maybe I should run out of time. How did you decide, this is from Sasha, how did you decide what to keep in and what to leave out? How did you sharpen the lens on Revenge Capitalism, especially given that it's an expensive, your view on revenge is expensive here?
It was like a trance. I don't know. I think there was a whole chapter that got cut, unfortunately, which will come out in some other form, about the history of palm oil and the way in which empires are lubricated and greased, literally and figuratively. And it was about that I regret not being able to include. I had long sections that critique the work of Quentin Tarantino. There are sections that we didn't get a chance to talk about today that are sort of cultural studies that range from Shakespeare to Herman Melville to Khloe Kardashian that did get included.
To Snapchat, which I'm so, your chapter on Snapchat, like, I think this is what I mean by the expensive nature of this, the object of analysis. Like, there's a way that you, even palm oil, which we didn't get here, but it's begging me to ask a question about the mediums and the circulation of these texts and the writing. There's something there that is begging me to. So what does it mean? How does palm nut particularly circulates? How does Snapchat? How does these, Shakespeare, I think he began by writing on the Merchant of Venice, and then we moved to Hamlet, and then we moved to Titus and Dragon. So there's these texts, or the Kardashians, and so there's these texts from multiple mediums, and then you are also you've organized this book in terms of with interludes, with chapters and interludes. So there is something happening here at the level of mediation that you are trying to also get us to think through in terms of revenge. That's happening at the textual level in terms of how you are writing the book. That I'm actually really quite curious if that was something that you were also thinking deliberately also.
I don't know if I can claim, I wish I could claim that there was some master plan or some master narrative. I suppose the way I set out to write a book is like this: is I pick the topic and you hold fast to it and you see where it takes you. And then eventually you start seeing it in many, many places, because I think the nature of capitalism today is such that it is a totalizing system. It really does dominate, or at least infiltrate and shape so many aspects of our lives and our reality, especially when you consider its full entanglements with colonialism and empire as well, that you will find its traces anywhere. And so for me, it's like a kind of forensic exercise when you're looking for a serial killer who's also the government and also the money, like it's everywhere and nowhere. And so you need to, I feel, have a kind of enthusiasm to try and see its traces in many places, and then be able to kind of weave together a story about it. And again, it comes back to that notion of storytelling and what, Winter, to return to her work, has this incredible provocation for us, which is to take responsibility for being human in a completely different way than we've ever done before. We've been told to be human in only the way that we seek to emulate Homo economicus. Exactly. And she tells us, no, there's something else there. There's a different way of telling a story about who we are and what we could be together and what we could be apart. And to some weird extent, I feel so haunted by that challenge. And I think it's this, in some way, across the gulf of space and time, that challenge she gives us rhymes with the challenge that Walter Benjamin gave us. And that is a debt that cannot be settled cheaply in some way.
Yeah, no. Huh. Um, huh. Hmm. It's funny when we began. I was thinking about. I wished I'd finished the book maybe yesterday, so that I could actually have gone back and reread Benjamin's The Storyteller. Because I was fascinated to reread that in relation to what Sylvia Wynter's the idea of the homonerons. I want to think about those two together, given your interest with Benjamin in this book. I really would love to have thought those two together. But you got me thinking now about, yeah. Oh, we have those conversations to have. Okay. Yes. There are two questions here. Maybe we can take these and because the responsibility that Benjamin is asking of us here is almost you talk about time and space. I'm thinking about the movement both going back and forth at the same time. Like, if you can use the angel of progress, for example, as an example, in some sense, of being responsible for both the future. I'm thinking back to the quotation, the grandchildren that he refers to, and the ancestors that he refers to as well. So there is those that the responsibility is also multi-directional in that sense. So it's not unilateral in that sense. And I find that really fascinating in terms of storytelling, in terms of the accountability and responsibility in that sense. That's one thing I'm thinking about. And that would necessarily require a different mode of narration in that sense. Anyways, I need to return to it and we need to have this conversation. But the two questions here, the first one is from Ruth Cutler, and she asked the question, what do you see as the relationship between revenge and justice?
It's a big question.
That's not a small question. I mean, it's just a small question, I meant.
To maybe just to try and answer quite briefly, I think in this book, let's say there's a difference between capital J justice and little j justice. So capital J justice is like the infrastructure of the state that insists that it adjudicates the laws and it enforces the laws and it delivers justice. This is the kind of, in the kind of canon of Western philosophy, the idea is that, originally, before there was a state and before the sort of Western government system, there was a war of all against all, and there was a sort of state of nature. And this state of nature, the European philosophers projected onto non-white people, non-Europeans around the world, and said, there's evidence of how humans are without the benefit of a state and a government to provide justice. And in that state of nature, revenge rules. There's nothing outside of revenge. It's just somebody hurts you, you hurt them back, you take something from them, they take something from you, etc., etc. With sort of, and this is the Hobbesian version, that, at some point there's a kind of unspoken and unsigned social contract. That means that we give up our right to take revenge and we give it to the sovereign, we give it to the ruler, and they then get to impose quote unquote justice, like big J justice, right? Like, so you don't go and kill someone who hurt you or took something from you. You take your complaint to the king or whoever, and they dispense justice. My argument, and it's not at all an original argument here, is that ultimately that justice that the king claims to deliver, that big J justice, is vengeance cloaked as justice. It's just a form of justice, and it's a form of revenge, and it's a form of systemic revenge that aims to reproduce the power of the sovereign. And in order to be able to reproduce it and to legitimize it, to say, yes, this is justice and not revenge, it instead casts revenge onto its others, onto those who seek justice, small j justice, outside of the terrains. So, in this case, we can think about peasant movements or peasant uprisings or anti-colonial uprisings, seeking justice, small j justice, which then the monopolists of big J justice claim, oh, those people are just pathologically vengeful. So on one level, the relationship between revenge and justice is a kind of mystification of the powerful. On the other level, though, there is something that we can't deny, that what we want when we want revenge in our own lives, and also in terms of an avenging imaginary of, our dreams of getting justice for the horrible crimes that have been perpetuated against people and against the earth. That revenge or that avenging is tied to a notion of justice. It's tied to a notion of a thwarted unfairness that we feel deeply and effectively. And so I don't want to necessarily say that all justice is necessarily just mystification. I think there is a desire for a kind of justice. But I think what impinges upon us is as that same moment that we reconsider what revenge means and think towards this kind of notion of avenging, we should think about, well, what would justice look like that is much more capacious and broad and opens up the possibilities for different ways of thinking, rather than imagining we know exactly what justice means or should look like. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that for the moment.
We have time for one more question from Jonathan. Jonathan Harris asked, he says that he encountered your ideas about revenge a couple of years back when he was focused on forgiveness. He wants to know whether it's fair to say you are working towards a sublimation of revenge.
I wonder how he means the word sublimation here. No, I don't think so. I think I'm working towards a revolutionary redefinition of revenge is what I'm striving for here. I'm striving to separate out this thing I'm calling revenge as a systemic and structural force from this desire for justice and this motivating imaginary I'm calling avenging. And so I don't so much want to sublimate revenge to other things. In fact, I think the desire to sublimate revenge is problematic in a lot of cases. So just, and I think it'll interest Jonathan, who does really fascinating work around money. Part of the theory that I develop in the book is that in some way for neoliberal philosophers, money is a sublimation of revenge. So not to get too deep in the weeds, at a certain point, their theory is that neoliberal economies where all of society is opened up to money and everything is determined by supply and demand, and where there's no longer any overarching sovereign, when we no longer have a state, essentially, we just have markets, then revenge will be conquered because we can sublimate our vengeful instincts and desires into competitive market behavior, and that will benefit everyone.
That's right.
This is a kind of extreme libertarian fantasy that very few people actually articulate, but still somehow animates the broader imaginary of the kind of neoliberal ethos. And you can read about it in very sophisticated ways in the work of Hayek or in the work of Francis Fukuyama, who has lately kind of moved away from it. But, so there's a sense that the sublimation of revenge in Western thought is often used as a way of thinking through contemporary institutions. Or to take another example, you have Nietzsche, who says, well, the sublimation of people's desire for revenge actually is what allows for society to function. Though he's not in favor of it functioning in the way that it is, or who knows what he's in favor of anyway. Now all the Nietzscheans are going to be angry at me. In any case, I think there's a problem with the desire to create a theory where you say, aha, vengefulness is our nature, and we sublimate it into something that's good for everyone. I don't think that that's a good approach. I think it's actually much more interesting to say, we don't know what revenge is. We're constantly redefining what revenge is and what work can be done by this kind of effort to redefine and re-theorize revenge. And I think that's less a work of sublimation and more a work of actually trying to raise it to the surface and make sort of more interesting terminology.
Isn't it a work of story? If I can go back to the idea of univocation, Benjamin's the storyteller. What's the distinction he makes between story and he makes a really necessary distinction between story and is it information or communication? And I find it the density of story where it doesn't seem to be about either sublimating it, or there's not stories, it's not about sublimating it, and it doesn't, with the story of then and the story of now, the temporality of it doesn't lose when the story is told in some sense, and I find that really quite fascinating in light of what you're saying.
I think this is in some way, I feel like something you and I together have been asking each other and ourselves for many years, which is, where should there even be a line between theory and story?
Exactly. Yeah. No. And I think that's one thing I enjoyed very much about this book is the writing of it, where it's the mode of how you engage with these theorists, how you wrote about their work was as if you were telling someone about them and not trying. So you were telling a story. It was a telling and not a theorizing. And if that even makes the distinction makes any sense at all, but you engage them in a mode of storytelling, in a narrative. So, which was exciting to see how you were citing them too. So it became less about prescriptive in some sense, and you had to actually leave behind yourself and also be there at once. There was this double movement in the writing of it that I found really quite energizing in some sense. It's actually really quite, when you say it's a hybrid of work, which you say at one point, it really, you stay true to it in the mode of the writing, the articulation of itself. And so, I'm excited about that. You are moving to that place of I think what we've been all struggling to figure out, how to merge, and not this creative nonfiction, but actually how to write something that we know in a mode that would actually make a difference in some sense. And so thank you for that. Yeah, thank you.